Now, my connection to this story is a little unusual. I'm not of this generation. I mean, I came of age in the early 80s, and the world had changed. In April, late April 1970, just before the incidents at Kent State, the Ohio National Guard occupied my hometown. I grew up in a little small town outside of Akron, about 20 miles from Kent. And there were a number of truck depots by the Turnpike exit. And in April 1970, the Teamsters went out on strike. And the company tried to break the strike by running through the picket line to get to the highway. As you can imagine, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters did not take kindly to this, and it got ugly fast. Their tires were shot out of trucks. The Teamsters tried to run the trucks off the guard unit that was in my hometown. Later, a few days later, roared off to Kent, took part in the shootings there. So this was an eye-opening of this little town I lived in, suddenly under military. It was just completely freaked me out. Guard camp in my home. This is the recreation field right directly across. That's my soccer field that pitched on. These were Teamster boogeymen to Governor Rhodes and his supporters. These were my Little League coaches, my Boy Scout leaders. And here were these soldiers pointing bayonets and guns at them. It just completely freaked me out. When the school buses went by where the guard was deployed, the bus driver made the kids lie on the floor of the bus, as if that would have done anything had anybody opened fire with M1s. But nobody talked to us about this. I mean, maybe it was just part of the time. I don't know. But because of that, when I later found out that these soldiers had shot people at Kent State and taken part in this tragedy, which was just this massive story at the time, especially up there, but also all over Ohio. I mean, it's really kind of part of our DNA, Kent State, when you grow up in these parts. It was just something about this incident that really captivated me. So I've carried this story with me ever since. And Kent State, May 1970, it led to my interest. I became a high school journalist. After that, I went to Ohio State on a journalism scholarship. I became a political cartoonist. I mean, I was really actively involved in this. I can trace a story really from my entire career back to Kent State 1970. And I know what you're thinking, really, a 10-year-old, had this epiphany. But I'm telling you, it's true. This is a drawing I made about the National Guard in my hometown. It's one of my first political cartoons. And this is one from the year after. That's actually Richard Nixon's king. That's not a bad Nixon for an 11-year-old. And a kid drew it because that's the monster movie horse Gallardi in the background, who I have running as against him, I guess. We would have been better off electing Gallardi. Now, a little context. I realize I'm talking to people here who know this stuff, but 1970, as I said, was one of the worst years we ever had, and the reason for that was mainly the Vietnam War, which by 1970 was a complete quagmire and just a total debacle. 1969 was one of the bloodiest years of the war. Over 11,000 U.S. servicemen lost their lives, about 25,000, 30,000 casualties. Unknown measure and expenditure in the war, and there just seemed to be no way out. Remember, some of you may know, and some of you do know, some of you may not, because I was talking to some of you about your draft numbers. Vietnam was fought by draftees, not by volunteers, as every war has been since. About 60% of the combat troops in Vietnam were forcibly conscripted. You receive that notice in the mail saying report to so-and-so a place at so-and-so a time, and a few months later you could be wading through the a rice paddy in the Mekong Valley, wondering if you were going to see the next day. And it was the draft that ripped this country in two, because you had 30 million young men, and it was only men, who lived in constant anxiety that they were going to get that notice. And it added rocket fuel to the anti-war movement. And by 1970, there were literally millions of people in the streets. And these were mostly young people. And this was a really unique situation where you had this generational rift in this country like we've never really experienced before. You had older Americans, 40 and up, who were in charge. World War II generation, Depression generation, World War I generation. And they had a very different attitude about war and service than every 35 draft age. Older generation said, you kids have to do what you're told, salute the flag, go to war. And there was a lot of people under 30 who said, we're not going. And that was the conflict. And it had spilled into the streets. There were campuses in flames. There were millions marching, and a fierce reaction by the authorities. And it seemed at that moment that the entire country was just teetering on the edge. It was really like nothing we had experienced before. As bad as 2020 was, 1970 was far worse. This is actually Ohio State. Ohio State had far greater violence than Kent State. Every public university was having a lot of anti-war violence. And over it all hung the specter of the Cold War and the seemingly invincible Soviet Union. That's the context when this story happens. But it's an incredibly relevant story. So much of what is happening now with the partisan divide, this kind of paranoia and misinformation, all of this stuff was playing out in 1970. The book was supposed to come out in May 2020 to coincide with the history of Kent State. It got delayed, you know why, because of the plague. And so it didn't come out until fall 2020. And over the summer, we had all of the BLM protests. We had just the conflict that was happening and the protester and police conflicts. And I just looked at this with absolute horror and thought, it's all over, I mean, we're going to have another Kent State. But it didn't happen. We came close, but it didn't happen. I was actually surprised by that. So when you sit down and do a book, and now I'm finally going to talk about the book, you have to ponder it for a while and think about, okay, what's my book about? There have been a lot of books written about Kent State, not in a while. It's been a while since there's been a new one. What will make my book different? Well, first of all, is the genre itself, is the art form itself, comics. That's never been done before. In fact, a visual depiction of Kent State has really not been done. There was one bad TV movie which came out in 1981, and that's pretty much it. So I really kind of had that all to myself. But I needed something more. I needed to figure out how I was going to craft this story. And very early I decided I'm going to focus on the four. I'm going to focus on the 4 kids who were killed on May 4, 1970. And the reason for doing that is that I wanted this to be a very tight, suspenseful narrative with a lot of emotional power. And you find that by focusing on the people who take part in these events, not upon these great events that I've just spent 10 minutes talking about, but zeroing in on the people. So I was going to show this story entirely through the eyes of these 4 people and their experiences. We see what they see, we experience what they experience. And when they're cut down, it's a gut punch. This book packs a wallop at the end. There were 4 kids, very typical kids, but also very exceptional kids. The oldest was 21, the youngest was 19, and she had just turned 19. They are from the top left, Sandy Scheuer, Bill Schroeder, Jeff Miller, Allison Krauss. 3 of them are Ohioans born and bred. Only Jeff was a transplant. He was from Long Island. Schroeder, for example, was a ROTC cadet, ROTC being the Reserve Army Training Corps. He was there on scholarship. He was just about a perfect kid, beloved by his friends, respected by his teachers, just an amazing, driven young man. He had the mind of a scientist and the heart of a philosopher. He used to write his mom's poems and send them home every week. Allison Krauss, at age 19, she was the youngest, was already a committed peace activist. She had taken part in many marches. She was a nonviolent protester. She thought the radical students who were stirring up trouble at Kent State were, as she put it, a bunch of finks. She was at times silly, thoughtful, intellectual, passionate, all of those things that a young woman finding her way in the world are. Jeff Miller, the transplant from New York, was an extroverted, fun-loving guy, very creative. Just one of those kind of kids who isn't sure where he's going, but he's going to have a good time until he figures it out. And then Sandy Scheuer, the last of the 4, was a bubbly, sweet girl. One of her friends described her to me as wanting to save all the puppies in the world. And then I added a 5th story of a young guardsman in my hometown at the trucker strike, and then roared in with the guard into Kent when they were called in. And he was present at every single event, right up until the shooting, and he was one of the shooters. Fired a single bullet probably into the air. His account is absolutely fabulous. The day-to-day life of a guardsman. The guard were just kind of yanked around by the politicians. And they had been on duty at that point for almost 2 weeks, sleeping in fields, sleeping on the ground, crappy food, go here, go there. First they're facing off against Teamsters, and that is a hairy duty for some badass dudes. And then they go into this situation in Kent, which is completely alien to them, completely untrained, thrown into this, what is an escalating series of very big, scary protests. And their commander, I will charitably describe as blithering incompetence, was it was a recipe for disaster. So the story actually covers 4 days in May. I boiled it down. There's a lot of backstory, and it really all started when President Nixon went on television on April 30th, 1970, and stunned the nation by announcing that the U.S. forces had invaded neutral and neighboring Cambodia. Nixon, just a few months earlier, had promised to end the war and was announced that he were drawing down forces and they would be steadily pulling out. Peace with honor, he called it. And now here he was, invading another country. The next day, campuses all over the United States exploded. Because here you had all these drafted kids who thought, that's it, I'm finished. My deferments will run out. I'm going to be drafted and shipped to Cambodia now, and I'm going to die. And it was an ugly scene. Now here in Ohio, we had a governor named James A. Rhodes, who was kind of a down-home glad-hander, dominated politics in this state for a quarter century, 4 terms as governor. Ohio's Rhodes sent out the National Guard troops, armed troops, to crush civil and labor unrest more than any other governor in the country. Texas's governor at number 2 wasn't even close. And Rhodes mandated that the Guard carry live ammo into civilian protests. Yeah, there he is, Nixon Rhodes. They were staunch allies. Rhodes helped Nixon carry Ohio, and the irony of this is that Nixon would later betray Rhodes and kind of throw him under the bus after Kent State, but that's another story. Now, in Kent, Ohio, Kent State, May 1st, the day after Nixon's announcement, actually began fairly peacefully. But that night, it got ugly. In downtown Kent, there was a bar district. The bars were packed that night. Anger kept building, building, building. The mayor completely freaked out. Again, you have this kind of mixture of politics, incompetence, and recklessness that produced the Kent State tragedy. The incompetence comes into play here. The mayor, who was just been elected, was kind of a rube, and he thought that, my God, all of the students at Kent State are going to rise up as one, come roaring over the hill, in my town to the ground, as if 21,000 students on a college campus all think exactly alike. But he actually believed this, and he begged Governor Rhodes to send the National Guard to restore order. Rhodes, and this is key, Rhodes, who was running for a primary election for an open U.S. Senate seat, which was to take place on Tuesday, May 5th, was anxious, desperate, really, to prove his worth to his. He was trailing in the primary and desperate to make up ground, and he wanted to prove that he was the guy who could keep law and order in Ohio. So when Kent State was handed to him on a silver platter, he jumped at the opportunity and he sent in the Guard. On Saturday, May 2nd, the day after that riot I was talking about, a group of radical students on the Kent State campus attacked the ROTC building, and they torched it. The ROTC buildings were attacked all over the country at this time, and a number of them were burned, so it was kind of a thing. The one on Kent State was an old Army field hospital from World War II, which had been bought at Army surplus sale, I guess, and moved to campus as a temporary building. This was 20 years previous. So it was basically a rat trap, and when the students tried to torch it, it went up very readily. It was also full of ammo, unbeknownst to anyone. So when one of the firebomb, the Molotov cocktails reached the ammo, it went up like a, as you can imagine, the Guard came streaming onto campus. Now, it wasn't because of the ROTC building, as a lot of people later put forth. The Guard was already coming. As I said, the Guard was right on the border of campus when the ROTC building was burned. But this gave them the optic, and it was the exact optic that Governor Rhodes wanted. Rampaging students, come to restore order and vote for me, please. Now, when the Guard came on campus, they swept across the campus in a brutal crackdown. And any student that they found outside, even ones way across campus, were beaten, chased with bayonets, gassed, or arrested if they were outside. The university was open. It was not closed. Governor Rhodes refused to close the university, so you had students who had absolutely nothing to do with anything that was happening elsewhere on campus. Most of them were sitting there gawking at this fire they saw taking place on the other side of campus, and then here comes the Guard over the hill. It's an unusual story, and it's laid out, these 4 days. Each one has its own climax, you know, kind of a violent climax at the end of the day, usually at night. So you get this kind of weird rise and fall, because after the violence, then the next day starts out very quietly again. Because this is where we get to know these kids. And this is where we see how they move through their day and how they interact with each other and their hopes and their dreams and their fears. This is all that research I did about their lives. I pour this into the book in these quiet moments. And they look like little boring moments, but there's a lot of emotional power here. I mean, think about, this is a scene on Saturday. That's Sandy Scheuer, and her mom shows up at her house to drop off a couple boxes of summer clothes that she wanted. It's just kind of a, you know, average little dull scene, really. But think about what we're looking at here. Because in 48 hours, her daughter will be dead. So this is the time that Mrs. Scheuer hugged her daughter, held her in her arms, smelled her hair. It's the last time she heard her voice. That's a really powerful scene. Sunday night was kind of the pivotal moment. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of most of the students at Kent State. There were maybe 400 who had participated in the trouble. So you've got over 20,000 students who had nothing to do with anything, and yet they're under martial law, and they're getting bossed around. The campus is basically under military occupation. There are checkpoints everywhere. The guard is pissed off. They're overtired. Tensions just rise and rise and rise. You get threats. Kids are arrested for no reason, just for talking back. And if you're a kid who had nothing to do with the protests, I mean, you can imagine how this would not go over well. That evening, there is a sit-in. A bunch of students march off to campus, have a sit-in in the middle of Main Street, and demand that military occupation end and that some normalcy is restored to campus. And this was the moment when tensions could have been ratcheted down. This was the big opportunity to diffuse this situation. But that is not the optic that Governor Rhodes wanted. So the guard attacked. And it was a brutal night of crackdown. There were over a dozen kids who were badly bayoneted. It was called the Night of the Helicopters, and 3 choppers flew overhead over the campus and also over the student neighborhoods and dropped tear gas on anyone they saw on the streets. The entire campus and town was covered in gas. And it was at this moment that all hope of reconciliation was lost. And it was a missed opportunity. The following day, there was a rally on campus, a small rally around that bell I showed you at the beginning. And this is when all these 5 threads really, because the Guardsman's there too, all these 5 threads that I've been following, they come together. And so for the first time, all 5 of my protagonists are together at the same time in the same place. Of course, we're poised for tragedy. Now, I don't think I have it there. The way it works, there's like 300 kids around the Victory Bell, and the Commons is like a bowl. It's surrounded by this low hill. And in the hillside, all around, were thousands of students. All had books in their hands. Again, the university is open. It's the noon class break. It's noon. And if you've been campus, probably not this one, but a major campus at noon, you know what that's like. Every building is disgorged contents, and there were just thousands of students moving around their day. The guard commanders mistook this for kids joining the protest. Most of them were just standing on the hillside watching to see what was going to unfold. And the guard attacked. They fired gas. About 110 guardsmen moved out in a line sweeping across the campus with bayonets. And it got ugly fast. And I show this in great detail in the book. This is really kind of the power of my art form, because it's a confusing series of movements. But with graphic narrative, I can show how this thing unfolds very clearly. And you can see exactly what happened. And then came the pivotal moment. A small contingent of the guard, no more than 10, we don't have the exact number, of a unit called G Troop, which is part of the 107th Armored Cav. They turned as one, and opened fire down the hill into a parking lot full of students, 500 students, most of whom had books in their hands and were walking back and forth to class. 4 dead, 9 shot and wounded. 5 of those were critically wounded. 2 of them were disabled for life. All but 3 of them were shot in the back or in the side as they dove for cover. It was an event that would scar this nation for years and still reverberates today. A lot of what we see playing out in the streets has aspects of Kent State in it. I can talk about that in a little bit. You can read all that in the book. Now, this book took me 4 years to put together. Now, I did start with interviews, and I like to do that. I like to talk to people who are actually there. And I still live in Northeast Ohio. I live in Cleveland, which is about an hour away from Kent. And Kent, as many major universities, most universities, just kind of spits its graduates out into the area, and they're everywhere. Especially in the fields that I'm involved in, the arts and in journalism, because Kent had a very good journalism program. So I would run into people all over the place. I knew who were there, and I'd get their stories. Those are the first people I approached. And I just began building this, I don't want to call it a database, just kind of building my knowledge about what was going on. Remember, I'm an outsider, as I said. So I had to somehow inject myself. This is the main library at Kent State. The top floor is the May 4 collection. Now, for a good 20 years, Kent State tried to bury the shootings, literally. They built a gym over part of the shooting center, which resulted in another giant wave of tent city constructed and a sit-in, and the police had to haul off thousands of people who objected to the gym being built, which was an absolute debacle, as you can imagine, for Kent State. So it was only for like the last 20 years that Kent State has finally come to embrace this history. And the May 4 collection is fabulous. It has just box after box after box of anything you can imagine. Court testimony, discovery, the papers of the mayor, the university president, thousands of pages of different accounts, stories. It's really fabulous. I spent a lot of time up there with the librarians. I also dove into the newspaper archives. This is the Daily Kent Stater, which was the student newspaper, which is a fabulous resource. Nobody covers a campus and a university town better than a good student newspaper. And the Kent Stater was a good paper. After the shootings, then I had to rely on the Akron Beacon Journal, which was the nearest big daily paper. The Beacon Journal actually won a Pulitzer for its coverage of the Kent State shootings. And the other papers who were covering. But the lead up, the Kent Stater was fabulous. And it gave me a window into the town and the time, because I was reading the listings and reading the classifieds and what was happening on campus and what bands were playing downtown. Just really helped form a picture. Now remember, this is visual. This is a visual medium, so obviously the visual research is important as traditional research. And I need to figure out what this campus was and what this town was. This is the campus. And this is from the 1971 student guide, which is one of those maps that they used to have. Could stumble around campus and find their way to their next class. And this is a fabulous map. I also had the one from 1970 because it shows all the buildings and their position on campus. I actually did this and made a giant map of my own, which I had hanging in my student buildings and the roads, so I could figure out what the scenes were as I was moving. scenes and have the proper buildings behind them and the proper buildings in front of them. And then I had to track down photo reference of all these buildings from 1970. Luckily, Kent State, as most universities, has a very good photo archive. They're taking photos of these buildings because they're proud of them. And slowly I began to build this visual reference and this visual picture of the scene. Now the town was a little tricky. This is Water Street, where that riot I was talking about took place that first night that really kind of sparked the whole tragedy. Now the top photo is Water Street in like 1972. The bottom photo is Water Street today. As you can see, very different. Again, it changes faster than a college town, especially a college strip like this. Not just year to year and decade to decade, it's month to month. You know, things come, they go, the buildings go up, you name it. You can see how much has changed. Whole blocks of this setting are gone. So I had to figure out exactly what this was like in 1970 because I wanted to get it right. This is a schematic I made of Water Street 1970 as I was putting this stuff together. I was using street guides, phone books to figure out what was in every building and in every plot. I went down to Kent and I would stand in front of a building that was still there, look across the street, see how the addresses lined up so I could figure out what was where. And slowly I started to build this setting. Kind of like a film set almost, you know? But coming up with photo reference was tricky. It wasn't like putting together the campus. It was a completely different process. So there weren't many photos of, say, Water Street in 1970 because who cares? It's this crappy little bar district in Kent, Ohio, and nobody's going to waste a roll of film on that. So it was really daunting. I found some, but I didn't have a complete picture, and it was really frustrating. And finally, I hit pay dirt. This is a documentary from 1971, and the narrator is talking about the Water Street riot, and there it is. There's Water Street. And I have the facades, and most importantly, I have the signs, and I had all I need. He's talking, we pan up and down the street. Now I'm just taking screenshots as I'm watching this on my computer. And I was able to reconstruct this scene and put in all that signs. And I was really happy to hear from the students of 1970. It's like, wow, man, you really nailed Water Street. That's just how I remember it. And I'm like, yes, man. You have no idea how hard I worked on that. And once in a while, you just find a little nugget of gold. In the May 4 collection, excuse me, they had a lot of personal effects from the people who were there, particularly the 4 dead. And this was in a collection of phone messages that were sent to Sandy Scheuer at the Speech Center and speech major. So she was always working in the speech labs with some students on speech problems. And phone messages, for the younger members in the audience, were the way that kids communicated with each other in 1970. There was no texting back then, so the way that they talked to each other, and of course they were talking as much as kids do now, so they would pick up a phone and they would call someplace where they knew that that kid was going to be. And in this case, it was a speech center. And there would be a student volunteer working at the front desk, and when the calls came in, I'd like to leave a message for Sandy. Okay. They would grab one of these message forms and write out the message, and then they would tack it to the message board. That's literally what that term means, message board. It was a large cork board that you tack messages to like this. And then the students would come in, see they had messages, and that's how they get their messages. So it's just a sweet little message from a guy named Steve Drucker, who was Sandy's friend. He was also Jeff Miller's roommate. So he was a really great interview, really a key interview. And some of the most powerful scenes in the book come from Drucker, who has never talked before. I was the first person who really landed him as much as I did. You know, it's a sweet little message. Hi, about supper at 5, I'll call you. And I took a picture of it because I didn't know if Drucker had a copy of it, and indeed he didn't. But then I noticed the name, Miss Beach. Her last name's Scheuer, Sandy Scheuer. Sandy Beach? What the hell is this? So I asked Drucker, what's up with his name, do you know? And he said, oh yeah, that was my nickname for her. Sandy, because that's what she was. She was like this sun-splashed sandy beach. And everybody else started calling her that. And I'm like, oh man, that's great. And so I worked it into the dialogue in the book, and nobody else has that. No one else has that. And that's just because I stumbled across a phone message and had the curiosity to track down what it meant. So my journalism profs would be proud if they were still alive. This is how I write. These are called emails or roughs. It's only on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of bond paper. And it's just a very rough sketch of what I want the page to be. And you can see I'm writing in the dialogue as well. I always write words and pictures together. They're never separate. And the next stage is a tight pencil. Now this is done on 11.5 by sheets of paper, 11 by 17 sheet of paper, so it's much bigger. And this is where all of that visual research that I did, this is where it gets poured into the book. So that's Allison and her boyfriend up there, that's nothing. But on the bottom, that's Sandy Scheuer walking down her street. That's actually her street. Those are the houses that are on her street. I put in the period cars, the period clothes. This is where it all comes together. So this is the most time-consuming part of the process. But you can see from the rough to the pencil how closely I picture that when I first conceive of it. I like to get this stuff down really fast. It's kind of instinctual at this point. It's my 4th book, so I mean, I've been doing comics now for almost 40 years. So, you know, this just from a lifetime of thinking and drawing and writing this way, I can get it down really fast and picture. They're almost like little film loops that play in my head, you know, and it's like, okay, that's how I want to do that. Then comes the inks, and then the finishes. So it's a 4-step process: rough, pencil, inks, finishes. Here's another row. These are 2 pages because I like to do the spreads, you know, because when you open a book, you're looking at 2 pages at once, right? So both pages visually have to work together. Like I said, this is the rough, and this is the moment when the guard moves on campus with the ROTC building in flames, and the guard is suddenly on campus. They're scared out of their minds. It's a completely horrifying situation with this, you know, building in flames, and they're in a strange campus, and God knows how many crazy radical students who are armed are out there. I mean, can imagine what their mindset was. So this is the pencil, and I know that I'm going to be pouring a lot of ink into here, but I don't have to put it all in. I mean, I'm already thinking ahead. And then comes the inks and finishes, and that came out really well, I think. That's one of my favorite spreads in the book, actually. And it really gets across that feeling of total alienation that these guys were feeling, which came from interviewing some of them and getting their memories of this particular time. So you have rough, rough, pencil, finish. And you can see again how clearly I see that. I mean, that's pretty much spot on. And that's how a book comes together. You know, this is a 260-page book or whatever it is. There's 260 roughs, 260 pencils, 260 finishes. So it's a very labor-intensive process. And the difference between, say, my type of comics, whatever you want to call this, graphic novels, there's a lot of them being done right now. It's a hugely popular storytelling form. The difference between my type of comics and, say, you know, your big corporate comics like Spider-Man, Batman, Walking Dead, is that everything you see here was put there by me by hand. Every word, every line, every shade. Whereas the big corporate comics, you have 5 or 6 people working on every one. It's like almost like an assembly line that comes out. So what you get here is a very, very personal piece of work. And I think that's what is making these books so popular. And right now they're just skyrocketing. I mean, it's really a golden age of graphic novels right now, as I'm sure the librarians can tell you. Now this is the very famous photo in Kent. The body of Jeff Miller. He was killed instantly when he was shot through the mouth. And this one was a problem. I really struggled with this. It's a very famous photo, probably one of the most famous news photos ever made. It was taken by a student photographer named John Philo, who won a Pulitzer for this photo that year. How'd you like to start off your career winning a Pulitzer Prize? It's like, well, how do I top that? Actually, he had a very great career. He's currently he's still working. He's the director of photography for CBS News. But the problem for me was, how was I going to depict this? You know, I've seen it done before. It's a pivotal moment. I kind of had to depict it somehow. But I just didn't want to replicate the photo. You know, you've seen, like, sometimes in film or a TV adaptation, they'll have a very famous image and they'll, like, replicate it exactly by freezing it. And I always found that to be really lame and stiff. In the TV movie, they did that, and it was just awful. So I didn't want to do that, but I had to depict it somehow, and I really struggled with it. This is the rough. You can see it's not coming together. I mean, the scream in the corner, and it's like I wasn't happy with it. So this was the only instance where I actually figured it out in the pencil phase, where I just figured it out by just starting to draw and see what came to me. And this is actually, I spread it out over 3 pages. So you have the previous page, and then you turn the page and open the book, and then you've got there. And you'll notice that I focus not on Marianne Vecchio and Jeff Miller so much, but I focus on the scream. And this comes from talking to the people in the parking lot that day about what they remembered, and what they kept telling me over and over again was the horrifying sound of the screams. There was this fusillade of bullets, 67 bullets over 13 seconds, and then a heavy silence that seemed to go on forever, and then just screams. And I thought, I've really got to replicate that. That's what I want to get across. That is, when I set out to do this book, I wanted this to be history that was felt, the way that the students of 1970 felt that history, and still feel it. I can't tell you how many interviews I had with some of those kids where they were in tears by the end of the interview. And these are people who were in their 70s now. And it still affects them that deeply. And I wanted to try to get that across, and I thought the scream was the way to do it. And the unique thing about comics, no other storytelling art form has, is our ability to make sound into an artistic element. So the scream starts on the previous page, it actually carries over the page and then follows leads the reader to the top of the next page where the story continues. And I was really happy with the way that came out. And that's my book.